Welcome to the screencast, Writing Well-Organized Paragraphs. This is part 1 of 2, Introductions and Conclusions. This is a graduate writing workshop from the University of Saskatchewan, and my name is Heather McQuinney. I'm Graduate Writing Help Specialist with Student Learning Services. I'd first like to review the learning outcomes with you for part 1. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to write a coherent introduction that meets your reader's expectations and write a coherent conclusion that successfully wraps up your paper. And what are we going to do in the screencast? Well, we'll start by talking about the shape of an academic paper. Then we'll look particularly at successful introductions and the general to specific pattern that most good introductions share. Then we'll talk about reader expectations for an introduction. Just what does your reader expect to see in an introduction? And finally, we'll talk about successful conclusions, and in particular, the specific general pattern. So what is the shape of an academic paper? Well, most papers are shaped like an hourglass. So they begin broadly, the introduction begins broadly, the body's narrower in focus, and the conclusion broadens out again. Now let's talk about the introduction itself. Most good introductions start generally, as we've said, they start broadly, and then they move to the specific. So then, how would they start generally? Well, normally with the broad context or the background to the topic or problem. Then quite quickly, an introduction will narrow down to the particular specific problem being discussed and to a thesis statement, or if you're writing a proposal or a thesis, your research questions or objectives. Then these might be followed by a short explanation of the paper's organization or a statement of significance, but not always. And sometimes the statement of significance appears nearer to the beginning. On this slide is the introduction to a student's paper. I'm going to read it. I'd like you to listen how she starts generally by providing the context for her reader, and then how she moves to the approach, and finally how she narrows the paragraph down to her particular thesis statement in the last sentence. In northern regions, river ice cover plays a crucial part in maintaining the integrity of ecosystems. Ice cover behavior is influenced by geological structures, hydrological processes, and meteorological conditions, making research in this field a complex undertaking in which many factors must be considered. Because of this complexity, researchers studying river ice have embraced a model known as transdisciplinary research. Rather than focusing on their own narrow discipline, transdisciplinary researchers share information with those from other disciplines to solve multifaceted problems. Using a transdisciplinary model that incorporates sustainability science, my research focuses on river ice cover on the Slave River and Delta in the Northwest Territories. This paper argues that because it enables researchers to tackle complex environmental problems, transdisciplinary research offers the most appropriate methods for studying river ice on the Slave River and Delta, particularly at a time when rivers, their ecosystems, and the communities they sustain are increasingly threatened by climate change. Let's look more closely at the paragraph now. So you can see how the student, as I'm sure you noticed, starts very broadly by discussing northern regions in general. And then she talks about river ice cover, and in general, why river ice cover plays a crucial part in the integrity of ecosystems. And she raises the issue of complexity, how complex this field is. And that lets her and she raises the research and the complexity of the research. That lets her then transition into talking about transdisciplinary research. So you see how she's getting closer and closer to her thesis statement as she introduces the transdisciplinary research. And then she defines it, and then she narrows down to her own particular research area, river ice cover on the Slave River and Delta, and then she gets to her argument, the thesis, about transdisciplinary research being the best method for studying river ice in her area. So if we have a look on the next slide, we'll see how, if you look at this visual representation, you can see how the student skillfully takes the introduction from the general broad opening, then tears down to her very specific thesis. So in addition to using a general to specific pattern, most writers of introductions also consider the expectations of their readers. What does the reader expect? Well, the reader expects his or her interest to be aroused, to be piqued. He or she also expects theories and terms to be defined or explained. And readers also expect that existing research will be introduced, at least in broad strokes in the introduction, and that a research gap or problems with the existing research will be introduced. And this is especially so in proposals and theses and dissertations. And readers also expect that the writer will demonstrate in some way why the topic or problem matters, and that in some fields, the readers may also expect that the organization of the paper will be explained. But this is not universal, it's optional. So on this slide is an abridged introduction to a student's thesis proposal. And I want you to notice how the student, again, as the last student writer did, begins with the context and narrows down, in this case, to his particular research objectives. And I also want you to think about some of the other things that we talked about in the last slide, about the introduction of the broad introduction to the research in the field, and the introduction of the research gap or problems with existing research. Cold regions and high mountains are considered to be sensitive to shifts in climatic conditions and thus to provide excellent indicators of climate change. In the future, the decreased water supply resulting from the loss of glaciers will have a particularly severe impact on arid and semi-arid regions. Snow cover on high mountains is measured using glacier hydrology models. Many of these models use methods that are simple and conceptual, or remote sensing and empirical. However, these glacier hydrology models may not work in remote mountains where only sparse data are available. The purpose of my research is to develop a glacier melt model to evaluate the climate change impact on downstream water resources in the Canadian Rockies. Specific objectives of the study are as follows: to develop an energy balance hydrological model for the high mountains, to study snow and glacier melt processes, and to test the model using field data archives and new measurements in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. I haven't included the third objectives just for space reasons. So you can see here, again, the student starts very broadly, high mountains in general, and how they are indicators of climate change, and then the impact of climate change, decreased water supply, and the impact on regions of the world. And then the student moves on to talk about models or methods for measuring snow cover on high mountains. And in fact, I've left some out here where he describes these various models. Then we get the research gap here, or the research problem here. And then he comes in and introduces his own research and his own objectives. Now, again, I've taken quite a bit out because he does review the research both in the first and the second paragraph. But as I say, for space reasons, I didn't put all of that in. And if you look again here at the shape of this introduction, you can see again how he's rather skillfully started very broadly and then gradually narrowed down, brought in the method, the models, and then gradually narrowed down to the gap or the problems with the existing research, the models, the purpose of the study, and finally his objectives. Let's move on to talking about the conclusion. Well, the conclusion is really the mirror image of the introduction. If the introduction starts with the general and moves to the specific, the conclusion does the opposite, starts with the specific and moves to the general. So it, rather than narrowing down like the introduction, the conclusion broadens out, taking the paper from specific claims made at the end of the body to the end of the whole paper. And it often starts by restating the position or thesis or conclusion, but in different words. And then it may summarize the reasons put forward in the paper to support the position or conclusion. And after it's done that, it may point to the limitations of the paper or study. That's often the case in a thesis, a dissertation, or a published paper. And it may discuss research or real-world or policy implications. Again, very often the case in a dissertation, thesis, or published paper. And it may suggest areas for further research. This is the conclusion, the concluding paragraph to the paper that we looked at earlier, the introduction that we looked at earlier on river ice cover in the Slave River and Delta. I'm going to read this out loud, and I want you to see how the student has started with the specific and then broadened out to the general. This paper has argued that the methods offered by transdisciplinary research are those best suited to study river ice cover in general, and specifically the ice cover in the Slave River and Delta. As the air temperature increases due to global warming, the ecology of the Slave River region is changing, and threats from flooding and other disasters are consequently increasing. The complex and multidimensional ecological problems facing the people, fauna, and flora of the Slave River and Delta will not be solved through discipline-specific research. Transdisciplinary research enables Slave River researchers to share information not only with one another, but also with indigenous peoples who live near the banks of the river. This type of research also enables the team to consider a wide array of variables and methods, such as modeling, remote sensing technology, sustainability research, indigenous knowledge, and communication research. This research model may offer a way forward, not only for the Slave River and Delta, but also for other polar and northern regions facing an uncertain future in the face of global warming. So you can see here how the student starts very specifically by restating the thesis, reminding the reader what this paper has argued. And you can see then that this is really the conclusion, and the conclusion was stated in the first paragraph as a thesis statement, and now it's repeated here in slightly different words. And then the student summarizes the reasons for why transdisciplinary research is the best method to study river ice cover in her area in the Slave River and Delta. She doesn't point to the limitations of the paper as she might have done. She does talk about implications and real-world implications here in the last line. So I have a little diagram of the conclusion. So here we are, her thesis, the impact of global warming, the Slave River Delta, it's a complex problem, and implications for the polar regions. So to sum up this short presentation, most introductions follow a general to specific pattern, starting with a broad topic and narrowing down to the thesis or the conclusion, research questions or objectives. Readers expect introductory paragraphs of an academic paper to arouse interest, define terms, introduce existing research and a research gap, and demonstrate why the topic matters. Most conclusions follow a specific to general pattern, starting with restating the thesis or the conclusion and broadening out to discussing implications. Part 2 of this presentation discusses body paragraphs.